A black woman is humiliated on the plane. When they discover who her son is, welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's dive in. Patricia Moore stood in her small but cozy living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, casting a warm glow on the hardwood floors. The hum of early morning surrounded her, a stillness she had always cherished before the world fully awoke. She glanced at the photos lining the mantel, memories that documented her son David's life, from his high school graduation to the moment he launched his first tech startup. Each picture told a story of perseverance, not just David's, but her own as well. Today, Patricia was packing for a trip she had looked forward to for months. She was flying to San Francisco to visit David. He had insisted on making the trip special for her, booking her a first-class ticket to ensure her comfort. The idea of traveling in such luxury made Patricia a little nervous. She was used to keeping things simple, finding beauty in modesty. But this trip was different. This trip was to celebrate everything David had achieved. As she folded her clothes neatly into the suitcase, Patricia smiled at the small gifts she had carefully chosen to bring along. A scarf she had knitted, a photo album she had compiled of David's childhood, and a book she thought he would enjoy. She packed them gently, her mind drifting to the days when David, barely a boy, had started taking apart computers and putting them back together. He was always ambitious, curious, and determined to succeed. Now, her son was one of Silicon Valley's rising stars, and the thought filled her with pride. With her packing done, Patricia took a deep breath and glanced around her home one last time before heading to the airport. This trip, she knew, was about more than just visiting David. It was a chance to reconnect, to be a part of his life in a way she hadn't been able to during the busy years when he was building his career. It was a moment for both of them to celebrate the hard work that had brought them to this point. At the airport, Patricia moved through the bustling terminal, her steps measured and calm. She had arrived with plenty of time to spare, an old habit from her years of working long shifts, always making sure she was prepared. As she made her way to the check-in counter, she couldn't help but feel a small flutter of nervousness. Flying was something she had done only a handful of times, and never in such luxury. When she reached the counter, she handed her ticket to the young agent behind the desk. The agent's smile faltered for just a split second, a brief hesitation that Patricia noticed. It was subtle, a momentary glance at the first-class ticket, as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the luxury of the seat she held. Patricia had seen it before, the assumptions people made based on appearances, but she chose to ignore it, focusing instead on the excitement of the journey ahead. The check-in process completed, Patricia made her way through security and found herself in the airport lounge, a space filled with sleek furniture and quiet conversations. She took a seat by the window, watching the plane's taxi along the runway. Around her, other travelers, mostly dressed in business attire, moved with purpose, their conversations hushed but full of importance. Patricia, dressed in comfortable but neat clothing, felt out of place among them. She adjusted the strap of her purse on her lap, silently reminding herself that this trip was about more than appearances. She was here to celebrate her son's success, and that was all that mattered. The announcement for her flight came over the intercom, and Patricia gathered her belongings, feeling a familiar mix of excitement and apprehension. As she boarded the plane, she was greeted by a flight attendant who directed her to her seat in the first-class cabin. Patricia took in the spacious seat, plush and luxurious, a far cry from the cramped coach seats she was used to. She settled in, trying to relax and enjoy the experience, though the luxury felt a bit overwhelming. As more passengers boarded, Patricia noticed a few glances directed her way. Some looked curious, others indifferent, but there were a few that seemed almost surprised to see her in first class. Patricia felt the weight of those looks, the silent judgments that came with them. She had experienced this before, in other places where she wasn't expected to be, restaurants, offices, even in David's tech company. But she reminded herself of the purpose of this trip. She was here to see her son, to share in his success. She had earned this moment through years of hard work and sacrifice, and she was determined to savor it. Seated in her comfortable first-class seat, Patricia allowed herself a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the long hours she had worked, the sacrifices she had made to support David's education, to give him the opportunities she never had. Her heart swelled with pride, knowing that all those efforts had paid off. David was living his dream, and she was about to witness the fruits of that labor firsthand. Yet, even with the pride came a small, nagging anxiety. It wasn't just the flight that unsettled her. It was the way people often treated her in spaces like this. Patricia was no stranger to the subtle prejudices, the microaggressions that came with being a black woman in predominantly white, affluent environments. She had learned to navigate them with grace, but it still stung each time. As the plane began to ascend, Patricia looked out the window, the city growing smaller beneath her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. This trip wasn't about the perceptions of others, she reminded herself. It was about celebrating David, about the pride she felt in her son and all he had achieved. Still, the feeling of being out of place lingered, like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to relax. She belonged here just as much as anyone else. She had worked hard, raised a successful son, and deserved every bit of comfort this trip promised. With that thought, she settled deeper into her seat, determined to enjoy the journey, despite the undercurrent of anxiety. Patricia gazed out the airplane window as the plane leveled off into its cruising altitude, trying to let the hum of the engines calm her nerves. The view below was breathtaking, the patchwork of fields and cities fading into the distance, but she couldn't quite relax. Despite her best efforts, the feeling of unease still clung to her. It wasn't the flight itself, but the subtle tension that had begun to build the moment she stepped into the airport. Sitting in the plush first-class seat should have felt like a reward for all the years of hard work. It was a moment to celebrate her son's success and the journey they had both taken to get here. But Patricia had learned over the years that being in spaces like this, where people didn't expect to see someone like her, always came with an undercurrent of discomfort. She tried to shake off the feeling as a flight attendant walked by. The woman, tall and perfectly composed with a bright, practiced smile, briefly glanced in Patricia's direction but didn't stop. Patricia noticed how she paused at the seats of other passengers, offering them drinks or asking if they needed anything. A few rows down, a middle-aged man in a suit received a cup of coffee with a warm smile and a brief conversation. Patricia waited, wondering when the attendant might offer her something, but after a few more minutes, it became clear that she was being passed over. It wasn't overt, nothing hostile, just an indifference, an assumption, perhaps, that she didn't need the same attention, the same grace. Patricia had seen it before, and while it no longer surprised her, it still left her with that familiar sting of exclusion. As the flight continued, Patricia noticed more glances in her direction. A couple sitting across the aisle from her, a well-dressed man and woman in their 40s, whispered to each other as their eyes flickered toward her. Patricia kept her focus on the book she had brought to pass the time, but she could hear snatches of their conversation. "Do you think she's someone important?" the woman murmured, barely hiding her curiosity. "I don't know. It's not often you see." The man's voice trailed off, but Patricia could fill in the blanks. She had been filling in those blanks her whole life. Patricia forced herself to keep reading, though her eyes had long since stopped following the words on the page. Her mind was elsewhere now, back in her childhood, when she had first learned what it meant to be treated as other. She thought about the times she had walked into upscale stores or restaurants only to be greeted with the same hesitancy, the same questioning looks. It was always subtle, but unmistakable. A short time later, another flight attendant came down the aisle, offering drinks to the passengers. When she stopped at Patricia's seat, her tone was polite but cool, lacking the warmth she had shown others. "Would you like anything to drink?" the attendant asked, her smile brief and mechanical. Patricia hesitated for a moment, wondering if she was imagining the difference in treatment. She knew better, though. After years of facing subtle forms of discrimination, she developed a keen sense of these shifts in demeanor. "Yes, just a glass of water, please," Patricia replied, her voice even. The attendant nodded curtly and disappeared to fetch the water. When she returned, she set the glass down on Patricia's tray without a word and quickly moved on to the next passenger, who was greeted with the same practiced smile that had bypassed Patricia. It was a small moment, perhaps insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but these small moments had a way of accumulating, each one adding to a reservoir of hurt that Patricia had learned to carry quietly, without complaint. Still, the weight of it could not always be ignored. The man across the aisle, still engrossed in his quiet conversation with the woman, glanced at Patricia again. This time, Patricia met his eyes, and he quickly looked away. She couldn't help but feel the familiar sense of alienation creeping in. She didn't belong here, at least not in the minds of some of the passengers. First class was a space reserved for a certain kind of person, and in their eyes, Patricia didn't fit the mold. She tried to refocus on her book, but the feeling of being watched, judged, lingered. She reminded herself again why she was here. This wasn't about them. It was about David and the incredible man he had become. She was here to celebrate her son's achievements, to share in his success, and she wouldn't let the perceptions of a few strangers diminish that. Patricia had learned long ago that people often made assumptions based on skin color, clothing, or demeanor. It was something she had experienced countless times, and while it always stung, she had developed a resilience over the years. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment, reminding herself that she had every right to be here. She had worked hard, raised a successful son, and she belonged in this seat just as much as anyone else. Still, no matter how often she faced these silent judgments, it never became easier to bear. As the plane soared through the sky, Patricia allowed her thoughts to drift back to her son. David had always been thoughtful, always caring. He had gone out of his way to make this trip special for her, insisting that she fly in comfort and style. He had worked hard for his success, and now he wanted to share it with her. The thought of seeing him again brought a smile to her face, pushing aside some of the discomfort she had been feeling. But the memories of past experiences still lingered. There had been times, even in David's world, where she had felt like an outsider. The tech industry, with all its wealth and privilege, wasn't always welcoming to people who didn't fit the mold. Patricia had attended events with David, mingling with investors and business partners, but she had often felt the same undercurrent of judgment, people wondering how she fit into the picture. As much as she tried to brush off these thoughts, they nagged at her. The flight attendants' indifference, the couple's whispered conversation, the glances from other passengers, it all reminded her of the unspoken barriers that still existed. No matter how successful David became, no matter how far they had both come, there were still spaces where she wasn't fully welcome. The announcement came over the intercom that the plane was beginning its descent. Patricia adjusted her seatbelt and glanced out the window. Below her, San Francisco came into view, the city bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Her heart lifted at the thought of seeing David, of embracing him after so much time apart. But as the plane descended, the weight of the experience lingered. It was a reminder, once again, of the challenges she still faced as a Black woman in certain spaces, and the assumptions people continued to make about her. She had learned to navigate these moments with grace, but they never lost their sting. The plane touched down smoothly, the familiar thud of the landing gear jarring Patricia back into the present. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that the hardest part of the journey was over. Soon, she would be with David, and none of the rest of it would matter. As the plane taxied to the gate, Patricia couldn't help but reflect on the small, silent battles she had fought throughout her life. Each one had left its mark, but each one had also made her stronger. She straightened her posture, reminding herself of the dignity she carried within her. No matter what, she would always rise above. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Patricia waited patiently, letting the rush of passengers pass by before standing to retrieve her bag from the overhead compartment. She noticed the way the flight attendants smiled at some of the other passengers, thanking them warmly for flying. When Patricia stepped forward, one of the attendants offered her a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. The words that followed felt perfunctory, like a script being read. Patricia returned the smile, her own calm and composed, knowing that she had already weathered far worse than this. As Patricia slowly stood up to retrieve her bag, she noticed that the flight attendants were now focused on another couple seated a few rows ahead. The smiles and engaging conversations were directed toward them, the warm hospitality that Patricia hadn't experienced during the flight. The contrast was clear, but she shrugged it off, reminding herself that she was here to see David and celebrate his success. She had learned long ago not to dwell on such things. Stepping off the plane into the cool air of the jet bridge, Patricia took a deep breath. The tension from the flight still clung to her, and the subtle judgments of the other passengers weighed on her mind. But the promise of reuniting with her son filled her with renewed energy. San Francisco was a city of opportunity, and David had carved out a place for himself here. That's what mattered most. Patricia followed the signs to baggage claim, where she found herself surrounded by travelers hurriedly making their way to their destinations. As she waited for her bag, her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom, I'm outside. Can't wait to see you." She smiled, the anticipation of seeing her son easing the tension in her shoulders. Grabbing her suitcase from the carousel, she headed toward the exit. The automatic doors slid open, and there he was, David, standing by a sleek black sedan, waving at her with a wide grin on his face. He looked every bit the successful entrepreneur she had always known he would become, confident, poised, and impeccably dressed. "Mom!" he called out, rushing toward her. As soon as she was close enough, he wrapped her in a tight embrace, lifting her off the ground slightly, as he always had when he was a little boy. "David!" Patricia laughed, hugging him back tightly, feeling the weight of the world melt away in that moment. Everything else, the glances, the whispered comments, faded into the background. This was what she had come for, to be with her son, to share in his joy and accomplishments. "You look amazing," David said, stepping back to take her suitcase. "I missed you." "I missed you too," Patricia replied, her voice soft with emotion. "You've done so well for yourself, David. I'm so proud of you." David smiled warmly, leading her to the car. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You know that." As they settled into the back seat of the car, Patricia took a moment to absorb the feeling of being with David again. The city outside the window blurred past them as they made their way to his home. But inside the car, all Patricia felt was peace. That evening, after they had arrived at David's modern, spacious home and enjoyed a quiet dinner together, Patricia felt relaxed for the first time all day. They had talked about David's projects, the exciting developments in his company, and the new app he was working on. As always, she listened intently, marveling at his drive and ingenuity. David had grown into the man she had always hoped he would become, confident, intelligent, and compassionate. But after dinner, as they sat together in his living room, David noticed the fatigue in his mother's eyes and the subtle tension in her shoulders. He had seen it before, the way she carried the weight of so many unspoken struggles, even when she tried to hide it. "Mom," he began gently, "how was the flight?" Patricia hesitated, not wanting to dampen the evening with her experience. She was used to brushing off these kinds of things. But David knew her too well, and he could sense when something was bothering her. "It was fine," she said, a little too quickly. "Just, you know how it is sometimes." David frowned. "What happened?" Patricia sighed, realizing she couldn't avoid the conversation. She recounted the small, subtle moments of the flight, the indifferent treatment from the flight attendants, the whispered comments from other passengers, the way she had felt out of place in first class, despite her right to be there. "It wasn't anything new," Patricia said quietly. "I've dealt with it my whole life, in one way or another." David's expression darkened as he listened. He knew his mother was strong, that she had faced discrimination throughout her life and always handled it with grace. But it angered him to hear that she had been treated this way, especially after everything she had done to get where she was. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that, Mom," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "It's not right. You deserve so much better than that." Patricia smiled softly, placing a hand on his arm. "David, I've faced worse. I don't let it get to me anymore. I've learned to rise above it, but you shouldn't have to," David replied, his frustration evident. "No one should." Patricia nodded, understanding his anger but knowing that it was a reality they had both come to accept. "It's part of the world we live in, but what's important is how we respond to it." David fell silent, his mind turning over what his mother had said. He had built a life in the tech world, a world that often prided itself on being progressive and inclusive. Yet, even here, His mother had been made to feel like she didn't belong. It wasn't something he could ignore. That night, as Patricia settled into the guest room David had prepared for her, David sat at his desk, his laptop glowing in the dim light of his office. He stared at the blank screen in front of him, thinking about the injustice his mother had endured. He couldn't let it slide. He had to do something. He opened his social media accounts, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. David was well known in the tech community, with millions of followers who respected his voice. He knew the power of influence, and he intended to use it. Taking a deep breath, he began to type, carefully crafting a post that would share his mother's story. He described what she had experienced on the flight, the subtle discrimination she had faced, and how it reflected a broader problem of racial bias in service industries. He made sure to leave out any identifying details to protect her privacy, but the message was clear. This kind of treatment needed to stop. He ended the post with a call to action, urging companies to better train their employees to recognize and combat unconscious bias, and reminding people that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter who they were or where they came from. When he was finished, David read over the post one last time. It was a measured response, but it didn't hide the truth of what had happened. Satisfied, he hit post and closed his laptop, knowing that by morning the story would be out there. The next day, Patricia awoke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She reached for it, blinking away sleep, and saw that she had dozens of notifications. Confused, she opened her social media app and quickly realized what had happened. David had posted about her flight experience, and it had already gone viral. The story was being shared across multiple platforms, with people expressing outrage over the way she had been treated. Some shared their own experiences of discrimination, while others called for change in the way customers were treated in service industries. Patricia's story had struck a chord, and the conversation was spreading. Patricia wasn't sure how to feel. On the one hand, she appreciated David's desire to stand up for her, to use his platform to advocate for change. But on the other hand, she had never been comfortable in the spotlight. She had always preferred to handle these things quietly, without drawing attention to herself. When David joined her for breakfast, he could see uncertainty in her eyes. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said gently, "but I couldn't just let it go. People need to know that this kind of thing still happens, and we need to do something about it." Patricia smiled, grateful for his protective nature. "I understand, David. And you're right. It's important to speak out. I just didn't expect it to get so much attention." David nodded, his expression softening. "We'll handle it together, Mom. Whatever happens, we'll make sure it leads to something good." By that afternoon, the post had gained even more traction. Bloggers had picked up the story, and news outlets were starting to reach out to David for interviews. The airline involved had already issued a formal apology, promising to investigate the matter and implement changes to their customer service training programs. But the story wasn't just about Patricia's experience. It had sparked a broader conversation about systemic racism and unconscious bias, not only in service industries, but in all aspects of society. People were sharing their own stories, calling for greater awareness and accountability. David and Patricia spent the next few days navigating the media attention, giving interviews and participating in discussions about the importance of equality and respect. For Patricia, it was a new experience, but she quickly realized that her story had the power to make a real difference. As the story gained momentum, Patricia and David found themselves at the center of a growing national conversation. What had begun as a single social media post had turned into something much larger. Major news outlets had picked up the story, framing it within the context of racial discrimination in America, particularly the experiences of Black women in spaces of privilege. Patricia's quiet dignity and David's call for change had resonated with many, and the story seemed to strike a chord with a wide audience. However, as the spotlight intensified, so did the emotional weight of the situation. It was early evening when Patricia sat on the couch in David's living room, scrolling through the endless comments on her phone. There was an outpouring of support from people who had faced similar experiences, with many sharing their own stories of being subtly marginalized or excluded. The solidarity was heartening, but mixed in with the supportive messages were more troubling responses. Some people accused Patricia of exaggerating, downplaying the significance of her experience. A few comments were dismissive, saying she was reading too much into things, and that these moments weren't worth getting upset over. Others were outright hostile, accusing her of using her race for attention. Patricia sighed, putting down her phone, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. It wasn't that she hadn't expected the backlash. She knew the world wasn't ready to confront some of these issues, but it still hurt. After a lifetime of facing quiet, subtle discrimination, it felt like being judged for simply speaking the truth. David, sensing her unease, walked over and sat down beside her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Patricia hesitated before answering, not wanting to burden her son with the emotional toll this was taking. "I don't know, David. I didn't expect it to become this big. I don't like being the center of attention, and some of these comments, they're hard to ignore." David leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "I know it's tough, Mom, but remember, this is bigger than just us now. You've inspired people. You've shown them they're not alone in what they're going through." Patricia nodded, knowing he was right. But the weight of it all, the attention, the backlash, the endless conversation was overwhelming. She had lived her life quietly, handling these kinds of struggles privately. Now the world was watching, and it was hard not to feel exposed. The next day, Patricia and David were scheduled to appear on a popular daytime talk show to discuss their experience. It was the first time Patricia would be speaking publicly about what had happened on the flight, and though she had agreed to do it, she couldn't help feeling anxious. As they arrived at the studio, Patricia's nerves were palpable. The makeup artist touched up her face before the show, and the producers briefed her and David on the questions they would be asked. Patricia could see the excitement in the crew, but she wasn't sure how she felt about the entire situation. She was a private person by nature, and being in the spotlight like this wasn't something she had ever imagined for herself. As the cameras started rolling, the host introduced them with enthusiasm, framing their story as one of courage and grace. Patricia sat beside David on the plush chairs, the bright lights of the studio making everything feel surreal. "Patricia, thank you so much for being here," the host said, turning to her. "Your story has really touched a lot of people. Could you tell us a little about how you felt during that flight and what it means to you to see this conversation happening now?" Patricia took a deep breath, her hands clasped in her lap. She had thought about what she would say, but now that the moment was here, it felt harder than she had expected. "Well," she began slowly, "I've been dealing with these kinds of things for most of my life. It's subtle, you know. People don't always realize how they treat you differently, but when it happens over and over again, you feel it. It's hard to explain, but it's real." The host nodded sympathetically. "And how did you feel when your son, David, decided to share your story with the world?" Patricia smiled slightly, glancing at David. "I was surprised, to be honest. I've always handled these things privately. But David, he wanted to make sure that what happened to me could help others. And I think that's important. I just didn't expect it to get so big." The conversation continued, and as Patricia spoke, she began to feel more comfortable. She realized that by sharing her experience, she was giving a voice to so many others who had been through the same thing. The weight of her words began to sink in. This was about more than just one flight. It was about challenging the way people were treated every day, in ways that often went unnoticed or unaddressed. When the interview aired later that evening, the reaction was immediate. Patricia's calm demeanor and heartfelt words resonated deeply with viewers. The story continued to gain momentum, and more people shared their own experiences of subtle prejudice. It became clear that this was a conversation America needed to have, but with the increased visibility came increased scrutiny. News outlets that hadn't covered the story before were now weighing in, and not all of them were supportive. One conservative commentator on a cable news show questioned whether Patricia's experience was being blown out of proportion. "Let's be honest," the commentator said. "We've all had bad service before. Just because someone didn't get a smile from a flight attendant doesn't mean it's racism. People need to stop playing the victim and start focusing on real issues." The words stung Patricia as she watched the segment, but David's response was swift. That evening, he posted another message on social media, calling out the minimization of racial bias and emphasizing the importance of addressing these issues, no matter how small they might seem. "We don't get to decide what's important for others," David wrote. "What might seem minor to some can be a daily burden for others. It's time we start listening instead of dismissing." The post went viral again, reigniting the conversation. This time, the backlash was even louder. People were debating in the comments, and Patricia saw the divide clearly. There were those who supported her and understood the importance of the conversation, and those who believed it was all exaggerated. The real tipping point came when the airline involved issued an official statement. They apologized for any discomfort Patricia had experienced, but their wording was carefully chosen. They didn't admit to any wrongdoing or suggest that what had happened was part of a larger systemic issue. Instead, the statement emphasized that they valued all their customers and were committed to providing excellent service to everyone. The lukewarm response angered David. He felt like the airline was trying to save face without really addressing the problem. Patricia, on the other hand, wasn't surprised. She had seen this kind of response before. Apologies that were more about optics than real change. David, however, wasn't willing to let it slide. "They're trying to sweep this under the rug," David said, pacing in front of Patricia in frustration. "They're not taking responsibility for the way you were treated. It's all just PR." Patricia watched her son, feeling a swell of pride mixed with concern. He was right, of course. The airline's response wasn't good enough. But she didn't want David to burn himself out fighting every battle. "David," Patricia said gently, "I appreciate everything you're doing, but sometimes these companies aren't going to give us what we want. That doesn't mean the conversation we're having isn't important." David stopped pacing and turned to his mother, his face full of determination. "I know, Mom. But if we don't push back, they're going to keep doing this to other people. It's not just about you anymore." Patricia smiled softly. "I know, but don't lose yourself in the fight. You've already done so much." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just want things to be different, Mom. For you, for everyone." "I know you do," Patricia said, "and they will be, but change takes time." The next few days were a whirlwind of media coverage, public debate, and conversations that seemed to touch every corner of the internet. Patricia watched from a distance, trying to keep herself grounded. She was proud of David for standing up, but constant attention had begun to take its toll. The comments, the public scrutiny, the emotional exhaustion, it was all starting to weigh on her. One afternoon, Patricia decided to take a walk through David's neighborhood, hoping the fresh air and quiet streets would help clear her mind. The weather was pleasant, with a soft breeze that carried the scent of flowers from nearby gardens. The gentle rhythm of her footsteps on the sidewalk helped soothe her, but her thoughts kept circling back to everything that had happened over the past few weeks. She thought about the flight, how what had started as a quiet journey to visit her son had turned into a national conversation about race, bias, and the treatment of Black women in predominantly white spaces. Patricia hadn't set out to make a statement. All she had wanted was to see David, to share in his success, to enjoy the time they had together. But the moment she had stepped into that first-class cabin, the assumptions had followed her, just as they always had. As Patricia walked, memories of her past began to surface. She had always known what it was like to be treated differently, long before this flight. Growing up in the South during a time of open segregation, Patricia had witnessed her parents face outright discrimination. She remembered the whites-only signs that once hung in front of restaurants and restrooms. She remembered the way her mother would hold her hand tightly whenever they walked into a store, whispering reminders to stay quiet and polite, to avoid trouble. Those were different times, but in many ways, the experience of being judged based on her appearance hadn't changed. It had just become more subtle, more insidious. The stares, the whispers, the assumptions, they followed her even now, decades later, as a grown woman who had worked hard to carve out a life of her own. Even after everything she had accomplished, even after raising a son who had risen to success in one of the most competitive industries in the world, Patricia couldn't escape those quiet judgments. Her thoughts drifted back to her mother, a woman of quiet strength who had taught Patricia to hold her head high, no matter what the world threw at her. Her mother had lived through the civil rights movement, had marched for equality, and had faced down the kind of hatred that left deep scars. And yet, she had always maintained her dignity. She had always taught Patricia that the only way to survive was to rise above it. Patricia smiled faintly, thinking of the lessons her mother had passed down. There had been so many times in her life when she had leaned on those lessons, drawing strength from her mother's example. This was just another one of those times. As Patricia walked further into the neighborhood, her thoughts shifted to David. She had always been so proud of him, not just for his success, but for the kind of man he had become. He had faced his own challenges as a young black man in the tech world, where diversity was still a struggle, and he had handled those challenges with the same grace and determination she had taught him. But now, seeing him take on this fight for her, Patricia worried about the toll it was taking on him. David had always been protective of her, always wanting to shield her from the hardships of the world. Even as a child, he had been sensitive to the struggles she faced as a single mother, working long hours to make ends meet and ensure he had everything he needed. She had worked tirelessly to put him through school, to give him the opportunities she had never had. And now he was using his platform to fight for her, for everyone who had experienced the same kind of quiet, persistent discrimination. But Patricia knew how heavy that burden could be. She knew the frustration, the exhaustion that came from constantly pushing back against a system that wasn't built to support people like them. She didn't want David to lose himself in that fight. She didn't want him to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, the way she had for so long. Later that evening, back at David's house, they sat together in the living room. The silence between them was comfortable, but Patricia could sense that David was still wrestling with everything that had happened. He had been quieter than usual, his thoughts clearly preoccupied with the backlash and the conversations swirling around them. "David," Patricia said gently, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about everything that's happened." David looked up from his phone, his expression softening at the sound of her voice. Patricia nodded, choosing her words carefully. "I'm proud of you, you know that. I'm proud of how you've stood up for what's right. But I also know how hard this kind of fight can be. It's draining. It wears on you." David put his phone down and leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "I know, Mom, but I can't just sit back and let them get away with it. You deserve better. Everyone who's been through this deserves better." Patricia smiled softly. "You're right. But I don't want you to lose yourself in this. The world can be cruel, and it's not always going to change as fast as we want it to. I've been through it my whole life, and sometimes you have to find peace in knowing that you're doing the best you can, even if the change doesn't come right away." David frowned, his eyes searching for hers. "But what if nothing changes? What if this all blows over and they just keep treating people the same way?" Patricia reached over and took his hand, her grip firm but gentle. "David, change takes time. I've lived long enough to know that. What you've done already has made a difference. People are talking. People are thinking. That's more than I ever expected to come from this." David looked down at their hands, his jaw tight with frustration. "It just feels like it's never enough." Patricia nodded. "I know. I've felt that way too. But you have to remember that every little step forward is still progress. You can't carry the whole world on your shoulders. You've done more than enough." As the days passed, Patricia continued to reflect on her life and the struggles she had faced. She thought about the jobs she had worked, the long hours she had put in to provide for David. She remembered the times she had been overlooked for promotions or treated differently by colleagues, even when she had worked harder than anyone else. She remembered the moments when she had felt invisible, when people had made assumptions about her simply because of the color of her skin. But through it all, she had found a way to keep going. She had built a life for herself and for David, one filled with love and pride. And now, seeing David carry the torch forward, Patricia felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had raised him well, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, she knew he would continue to fight for what was right. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Patricia noticed a change in David's demeanor. He seemed calmer, more at peace. The intensity that had been burning in him over the past few weeks had softened. "I've been thinking about what you said, Mom," David said as he passed her a plate of food, "about how change takes time." Patricia looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "I've realized that you're right. I've been so focused on trying to fix everything all at once, but that's not how the world works. We're not going to change people's minds overnight. But what we've done, it started a conversation, and that's something. Patricia smiled warmly, feeling a sense of relief. I'm glad you're seeing it that way. You've already made a huge difference, David, and you're going to keep making a difference in ways you might not even realize. David nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Thanks, Mom. I don't want to let you down. Patricia reached over and squeezed his hand. You could never let me down. I'm proud of you, no matter what. That night, as Patricia lay in bed, she thought about the journey she had been on, the struggles she had faced, the quiet battles she had fought, and the strength she had drawn from her mother and from her own experiences. She knew there would always be challenges, that the fight for equality was far from over. But she also knew that she had raised a son who would continue that fight, who would carry the lessons she had taught him forward into the world, and that gave her hope. The following morning, the air in David's home was lighter. For the first time in weeks, Patricia felt the tension in her shoulders start to ease. After their heartfelt conversation the night before, Patricia sensed a change in David. The burden of the fight had lifted slightly from his heart, and for the first time since her arrival, they both allowed themselves to focus on something simpler, the joy of being together. It was a Saturday, and David had planned the day around reconnecting with his mother in a more personal way, far from the whirlwind of media attention and social justice conversations. The city of San Francisco, with its charming streets, iconic bridges, and seaside views, was theirs to explore. Mom, I want to take you to one of my favorite spots, David said as they finished breakfast in his modern kitchen. His smile was genuine, the stress of recent days replaced with the excitement of sharing something close to his heart. I think you'll love it. Patricia smiled back, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in days. I can't wait. It's been too long since we've had time like this. They gathered their things and stepped outside into the fresh morning air, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of the ocean. David had hired a private car to take them to the Golden Gate Park, a vast green expanse in the heart of the city. As they drove, Patricia marveled at the beauty of San Francisco, with its rolling hills, cable cars, and towering buildings. David chatted animatedly about his projects, sharing the details of his work in a way he hadn't been able to since Patricia's arrival. It was clear that being away from the intensity of the media had brought him some peace, and Patricia listened with pride, knowing how far her son had come. When they arrived at the park, the car dropped them off near a quiet entrance, away from the crowds. David led Patricia down a winding path that opened up to a breathtaking view of the Conservatory of Flowers, a stunning Victorian glass structure nestled among vibrant gardens. This is where I come to think, David explained as they walked, his tone soft and reflective. Whenever things get too overwhelming, I come here to clear my mind. Patricia smiled, touched that David was sharing this special place with her. It's beautiful, she said, taking in the sight of the flowers blooming in every direction. I can see why you love it here. They strolled through the gardens, their conversation light and easy. It felt like old times, before the fame, before the pressure of public life. David had always been her little boy, the one who tinkered with computers and asked a million questions. But now he was a man, a successful entrepreneur with the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. And yet, in moments like these, Patricia could still see traces of the child he had once been to. As they continued walking, they found a bench tucked away under a large tree, its branches casting dappled sunlight on the ground. They sat down, the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling filling the quiet between them. I'm glad we're doing this, David said after a while, his voice gentle. I've missed you, Mom. With everything going on, I feel like I haven't had the chance to just be with you. Patricia reached over and squeezed his hand. I've missed you too, and I'm proud of everything you've done, David. You've handled all of this with so much strength. David smiled softly, looking down at their joined hands. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how change takes time. You were right. I've been pushing so hard because I wanted everything to be better for you, for all of us. But now I see that it's not about winning every battle. It's about making sure we're moving in the right direction. Patricia's heart swelled with pride as she looked at her son. He had grown into such a thoughtful, compassionate man, and though the world could be harsh, she knew he had the strength to face it. That's all we can do, Patricia said, her voice steady. Keep moving forward, step by step. And remember, you don't have to do it all on your own. David nodded, his expression softening. I know, Mom. I'm just glad you're here with me. It means everything. The rest of the day was filled with laughter and memories. They spent hours walking through the park, visiting different gardens, sharing stories about David's childhood, and reminiscing about their lives before everything had changed. Patricia felt a deep sense of contentment being with David, the worries of the past few weeks fading into the background. They took pictures together, laughing as David struggled to get the perfect angle for a selfie in front of the conservatory of flowers. Patricia playfully scolded him for not knowing how to use his phone's camera properly, despite being a tech genius. You'd think you'd have this down by now, Patricia teased, laughing as David finally snapped a picture they were both happy with. Hey, I'm better with coding than cameras, David shot back with a grin. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, they found themselves back at the entrance where the car was waiting to take them home. Patricia's heart felt full. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this. Just a day to enjoy the simple pleasure of being with her son. Later that night, back at David's house, they sat together in the living room, sipping tea. The atmosphere was relaxed, and the weight that had been hanging over them for weeks seemed to have lifted. I think this was exactly what we needed, Patricia said, leaning back in her chair, her eyes closed in contentment. David smiled, watching his mother with a sense of peace. Yeah, I think so too. There was a pause before David spoke again, his voice softer this time. You know, I've been thinking about how far we've come, about everything you've done for me. I wouldn't be where I am today without you, Mom. You gave me everything, even when it wasn't easy. Patricia opened her eyes and looked at him, her expression full of love. That's what mothers do, David, and you've made it all worth it. Seeing you become the man you are today, there's no greater reward. David's eyes glistened with emotion, and he reached over to take his mother's hand. I just want you to know how much I appreciate you. Everything you've sacrificed, everything you've taught me, I'm so grateful. Patricia smiled, her heart full. I know, David, and I'm grateful too. We've come a long way, and I wouldn't change a thing. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the bond between them stronger than ever. Despite everything they had been through, Patricia knew that they would always have each other. And that was all that mattered. Patricia had hoped the peace she and David found during their day in the park would last, but as the days went by, the attention from the public and the media began to swell once more. David's social media post about the airline had gone viral again, spurred by renewed interest from journalists who were covering the story of discrimination in the tech industry. The conversation had broadened, and more people began to come forward with their own stories of bias and mistreatment in various fields: hospitality, corporate America, and even everyday interactions. Despite the positive side of the growing movement, the tension began to return. For Patricia, the media storm felt like a constant reminder of the flight that had started it all. The whispers, the judgmental glances, the cold treatment. These weren't new experiences, but now they were part of a public conversation, one she never asked to be in the center of. One evening, Patricia was sitting in the living room, flipping through the channels on TV, when she stumbled across a news panel discussing the story that had, unbeknownst to her, been reignited. On the screen, commentators debated whether the airline's apology had been sufficient, with some arguing that the company needed to do more, while others dismissed the incident as overblown. This isn't about one woman's bad experience on a flight, one commentator said, his tone dismissive. It's about people blowing things out of proportion. Do we really need to make every minor inconvenience into a social justice cause? Patricia's heart sank as she listened, her hands tightening around the remote. She had spent her entire life brushing off these so-called minor inconveniences, but hearing them reduced to nothing on national television was like reliving the flight all over again. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, deeply rooted issue, one that she and so many others had been dealing with quietly for years. Just then, David entered the room, immediately noticing the look on his mother's face. He followed her gaze to the television, where the debate continued to rage on. Without a word, he walked over and grabbed the remote from her, turning off the TV. You don't need to watch that, he said gently, sitting down next to her. Patricia let out a long sigh, rubbing her temples. I know, but it's everywhere, David. No matter where I turn, it feels like this story won't go away. David placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice calm but determined. Mom, I know this is hard, but what you've gone through, what we've both gone through, it matters. This isn't just about the flight. It's about how people like us are treated every day, and it's finally getting the attention it deserves. Patricia nodded, but the weight of it all still pressed down on her. I just didn't expect to be the one in the middle of it. David gave her a small smile. Sometimes we don't choose the battles that come to us, but we can choose how we fight them. You've been fighting this your whole life, Mom. Now people are finally listening. The next day, David received an email from the airline requesting a private meeting. They wanted to discuss the public backlash in more detail and clarify their stance on the situation. Patricia was hesitant when David told her about the request, unsure if facing the company would bring any real change, but David convinced her that this was an opportunity they couldn't ignore. They're reaching out because they know they've done wrong, David said. This is our chance to make sure they don't just brush it under the rug. After some thought, Patricia agreed. She had never been one for confrontation, but she realized this might be her chance to speak not just for herself, but for everyone who had experienced what she had. The meeting was arranged at the airline's corporate headquarters in downtown San Francisco. The building was sleek and imposing, with glass walls and marble floors that reflected the towering skyscraper surrounding it. As Patricia and David walked into the lobby, they were greeted by a receptionist who escorted them to a private conference room. Inside, 3 executives from the airline sat waiting for them, along with a public relations manager who immediately introduced herself. Her tone was friendly, but Patricia could sense the rehearsed professionalism behind it. They were here to manage a crisis, not to listen. Thank you so much for coming in today, the PR manager began, offering them both seats. We want to start by saying how much we appreciate the dialogue this situation has opened up. At our company, we value every customer, and we're committed to making sure all passengers have a positive experience. David sat forward, his eyes sharp. If that's true, then why did my mother have to endure what she went through? The cold treatment, the judgmental looks from the staff, this wasn't just a bad experience. It was a pattern of behavior that's all too common. The executives exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. The PR manager cleared her throat. We understand that there were some issues during the flight, and we deeply regret any discomfort your mother experienced. However, we'd like to emphasize that our staff is trained to treat all customers equally. Patricia listened as they spoke, but the more they talked, the more it felt like they were trying to shift the conversation away from the real issue. There was no acknowledgement of the deeper problem, no recognition that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of racial bias. Finally, Patricia couldn't stay silent any longer. With all due respect, Patricia said, her voice steady but firm, I don't believe this is just about training. I've been treated this way my whole life, in stores, in restaurants, in offices. This wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last. Your staff may be trained, but that doesn't mean they're free of the biases they carry with them. The room went quiet. The PR manager looked at Patricia, clearly caught off guard by her directness. I'm not asking for special treatment, Patricia continued. I'm asking for the same respect and dignity you give to every other passenger. That's what this is about. One of the executives, a middle-aged man with graying hair, finally spoke up. We understand, Mrs. Moore, and we want to do better. We're looking at this as an opportunity to improve our training and make sure all of our employees are aware of the importance of treating every customer fairly. David's frustration was evident, but Patricia placed a hand on his arm, silently telling him to let her handle it. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to confront these situations was with quiet strength. I appreciate that, Patricia said, her tone calm but unyielding. But I also want to make sure this isn't just about saving face for your company. This is about real change. It's about understanding that what I went through wasn't just a bad day for your staff. It's something I've been dealing with for decades. I want to know that you're committed to making sure no one else has to feel the way I felt that day. The executives shifted in their seats, clearly unsure of how to respond. But after a moment, the head of the group, The same man who had spoken earlier nodded. "You're right," he said quietly. "We've been looking at this the wrong way. This isn't just a one-off issue. We need to address the bigger picture." Patricia felt a small sense of relief as she heard his words, though she knew there was still a long way to go. She and David left the meeting with a promise from the airline that they would take concrete steps toward addressing the problem, including implementing bias training and conducting a thorough review of their internal practices. As they walked out of the building, Patricia felt lighter. The conversation hadn't solved everything, but it was a step in the right direction. For once, her voice had been heard, and she hoped that it would lead to real change, not just for her, but for everyone who had faced the same quiet discrimination she had. David, however, was still tense. He had wanted more accountability, more acknowledgement of the damage that had been done. But as they stepped into the sunlight outside, Patricia squeezed his hand. "You did good, David," she said softly. "We did good." David looked at her, his frustration melting away as he smiled. "Yeah, we did." In the weeks following their meeting with the airline, Patricia and David began to see the impact of their efforts ripple outward. The airline, true to their word, announced a series of initiatives designed to address the concerns raised by Patricia and the broader public. They committed to comprehensive bias training for all employees, from flight attendants to corporate executives, and they launched a review of their customer service policies to ensure that every passenger, regardless of race or background, would be treated with equal respect. For Patricia, the changes were meaningful, though she remained cautiously optimistic. She had lived long enough to know that real change didn't happen overnight. Policies and promises were one thing, seeing them through was another. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had been heard. David, on the other hand, felt invigorated. The success of their meeting with the airline had reignited his passion for social justice, and he began using his platform to speak out more frequently about racial bias, not just in the airline industry, but in the tech world too. His posts were thoughtful and measured, but they carried weight, sparking conversations that stretched far beyond his usual circle of followers. One day, as Patricia sat at the kitchen table, sipping her tea and scrolling through her phone, she came across an article on a major news site. The headline caught her attention immediately. "Airline Bias Training, a New Era of Customer Service." Intrigued, she clicked on the link and began reading. The article detailed the changes the airline was making in the wake of Patricia's experience, framing it as part of a larger movement toward inclusivity in service industries. It quoted experts on unconscious bias, highlighted the importance of representation, and even referenced the broader conversation that had emerged from David's viral post. Patricia felt a swell of pride as she read, knowing that her story had been the catalyst for something bigger. But as she scrolled down, something else caught her eye. In the comments section, people were sharing their own stories, experiences of discrimination in airports, hotels, restaurants, and workplaces. Some were subtle, like Patricia's experience on the flight, while others were more overt. But all of them spoke about the same underlying issue, the quiet, persistent bias that people of color face every day. One comment in particular stood out to Patricia. It was from a young Black woman who described her experience working in retail. She wrote about how customers often ignored her, asking for help from her white colleagues instead, even when she was standing right there, ready to assist. The woman's frustration and exhaustion were palpable, and Patricia could feel her pain in every word. "I just want to be seen," the woman had written. "I want people to see me for who I am, not what they think I am." Patricia set down her phone, her heart heavy. She had been that woman once, overlooked, dismissed, reduced to a stereotype. She knew how it felt to want to be seen, to be recognized by her humanity. And though she was proud of the change she and David had sparked, she knew there was still so much work to be done. David, too, had noticed the shift in the conversation. His social media platforms were flooded with messages from people all over the country, thanking him for bringing attention to the issue. But there were also messages from those who felt disillusioned, who had faced similar experiences, and didn't believe that a few policy changes would make any real difference. One message in particular stayed with him. It was from a young man who worked in tech, like David, and who had faced discrimination in his own workplace. The man wrote about the isolation he felt, being one of the few black engineers at his company. He described the subtle ways in which he was made to feel like an outsider, the assumptions that were made about his skills, the way his contributions were sometimes overlooked in meetings, the sense that he had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. "It feels like no matter what I do," the man had written, "I'm always on the outside looking in." How do we fix that? David read the message over and over again, the words sinking into him like a weight. He knew exactly how that young man felt. He had been in that position more times than he could count, and even now as a successful entrepreneur, he still felt the pressure of having to prove himself, of having to navigate spaces that weren't built for people like him. But as he sat at his desk, staring at the screen, David realized that the message wasn't just a cry for help. It was a challenge, a call to action, and he knew what he had to do. That evening, David sat down with his laptop and began drafting a new post. This time, he wasn't just addressing the airline industry. He was speaking to the broader issue of representation, diversity, and inclusion in all sectors, particularly in tech, where the problem was especially pervasive. In his post, David shared his own experiences of feeling isolated in the tech world, of having to constantly prove himself in ways that his white colleagues didn't. He wrote about the importance of mentorship, of creating spaces where people of color could feel supported and seen, and he called on tech leaders to do more, to hire more diverse talent, to invest in training programs that addressed unconscious bias, and to foster cultures of inclusion, not just diversity for diversity's sake. Diversity isn't a checkbox, David wrote. It's about changing the way we think, the way we interact, and the way we build our companies. It's about making sure that everyone, no matter their race or background, has a seat at the table. When he finished the post, David hit publish and watched as the responses started pouring in almost immediately. This time, the conversation went even further. Leaders in the tech industry began sharing the post, acknowledging the need for change and committing to doing better. Organizations that focused on diversity and inclusion reached out to David, asking him to collaborate on initiatives to address the very issues he had raised. It wasn't long before the media picked up the story, framing it within the larger context of racial inequality in corporate America. David found himself being interviewed by major outlets, not just about the airline incident, but about the broader movement he had become a part of. And though he was careful to keep the focus on the issue at hand, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in what he and his mother had accomplished. Meanwhile, Patricia watched from the sidelines, content to let David take the lead. She had always preferred to stay out of the spotlight, but she couldn't help feeling a deep sense of satisfaction as she saw the changes unfolding. The airline's policy changes were just the beginning. Other companies, inspired by the public reaction, began to follow suit, implementing their own bias training and reevaluating their customer service protocols. Patricia received messages from people across the country, thanking her for sharing her story and for sparking a conversation that had been long overdue. But the most meaningful messages came from those who had faced similar experiences. People who, like Patricia, had spent years being treated as though they didn't belong, as though their presence in certain spaces was always questioned. For those people, Patricia's story had given them a voice, a sense that they weren't alone in their struggles. And for Patricia, that was more than enough. As the weeks passed, the momentum continued to grow. David began working with a group of tech entrepreneurs to develop a new initiative aimed at increasing diversity in the tech sector. The initiative, which would provide mentorship and networking opportunities for young people of color entering the industry, was quickly gaining traction. David was determined to ensure that the next generation of Black engineers and entrepreneurs wouldn't have to face the same barriers he had. Patricia, though still wary of the media attention, found herself becoming more comfortable with the idea that her story had made a difference. She continued to support David from behind the scenes, offering her wisdom and guidance as he navigated the complexities of advocacy work. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch of David's home, watching the sun set over the city, Patricia turned to her son with a smile. "You know," she said softly, "I never thought I'd see the day when something like this would happen." David looked at her, his expression curious. "What do you mean?" Patricia chuckled. I mean, I've spent my whole life dealing with this kind of thing, being judged, being treated differently, and I always thought it was just the way things were. But now, seeing the changes that are happening, it gives me hope. Hope maybe things really can get better. David smiled, his heart full of pride for his mother. They will get better, Mom, because of people like you. Patricia shook her head. No, David, because of people like you. The weeks that followed were transformative. What had begun as Patricia's quiet fight for dignity on a single flight had turned into a national movement. David's continued advocacy in the tech world, combined with Patricia's story, had sparked meaningful discussions in corporate boardrooms and community halls alike. Conversations about racial bias and systemic inequality were being held in places where such topics had been avoided or ignored for too long. But with progress came resistance. As Patricia and David's story gained traction, the inevitable backlash grew louder. Critics emerged, accusing them of overplaying the race card or using their platforms for personal gain. Patricia saw the same dismissive comments on social media that had plagued her throughout her life. But now, they were amplified by the public eye. Every step forward seemed to be met with a wave of criticism, questioning their motives and undermining their message. David, for his part, handled it with grace. He had long understood the nature of public advocacy. Progress was never without opposition, but the negativity affected him more deeply than he let on. His drive to make a difference had turned into long nights at his computer, responding to messages, working with diversity and inclusion groups, and speaking at virtual events. He rarely allowed himself time to rest, constantly pushing forward. Patricia, who had been watching David with growing concern, knew that he was burning out. She could see it in the dark circles under his eyes, in the way his shoulders slumped as he sat at his desk late into the night. One evening, as she found him sitting in his office, poring over a new proposal for a diversity initiative, she decided it was time to intervene. David, she said softly, stepping into the room, you need to rest. David looked up, surprised by the concern in her voice. I'm fine, Mom. I just need to finish this. Patricia shook her head, walking over to him. No, you're not fine. You've been working yourself to the bone, and it's not healthy. You need to take a step back. David let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. I can't just stop, Mom. There's so much to do. So many people are counting on us. I know, Patricia said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. But you can't help anyone if you're burned out. You've done so much already. It's okay to take a break. David leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. It just feels like, if I stop now, it'll all fall apart. Patricia knelt down beside him, looking up into his eyes. David, you've started something important. But it's not just on your shoulders. The world is paying attention now because of what you've done. You've built something bigger than yourself, and that's not going to disappear just because you take a moment to rest. David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his exhaustion. He had been carrying so much for so long, driven by the desire to create a better world for his mother, for others like her. But Patricia's words reminded him of something he had forgotten. He wasn't alone in this fight. The next morning, Patricia convinced David to take a day off. They spent the day together, walking through the city, sharing a quiet lunch at a small cafe, and simply enjoying each other's company. For the first time in weeks, David felt like he could breathe. As they sat together on a bench overlooking the bay, Patricia turned to him, her expression thoughtful. You know, she said, I've been thinking a lot about what this whole experience has meant, for both of us. David looked at her, curious. What do you mean? Patricia smiled softly. I've spent my whole life dealing with these kinds of struggles, and for a long time I thought it was just the way things were. But now, seeing everything that's happened, seeing the change we've started, it makes me realize that maybe things don't have to stay the same. David nodded, understanding what she meant. It's hard to see progress when you're in the middle of it, but we're making a difference, little by little. Patricia looked out at the water, her heart full of both hope and pride. I never imagined I'd be part of something like this. I've always kept my head down, stayed quiet, and just tried to get by. But now I see that speaking up can make a real difference. And I have you to thank for that. David smiled, his heart swelling with love for his mother. You've always been strong, Mom. I just helped the world see it. The final crescendo came when Patricia and David were invited to speak at a national conference on racial equity and inclusion. The event was being held in Washington, D.C., and it would be their first time addressing such a large audience in person. Leaders from various industries were attending, and Patricia was nervous about standing on such a big stage. But David reassured her that this was their moment to solidify the impact they had already made. The day of the conference, Patricia stood backstage with David, her hands trembling slightly as she listened to the sound of the crowd gathering in the auditorium. She had never been one for public speaking, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. But today, she knew she had something important to say. When it was their turn to take the stage, David led her out, the bright lights temporarily blinding them as they faced the audience. The applause was thunderous, but Patricia barely heard it, her focus on the message she wanted to deliver. David began by introducing their story, how it all started with a simple flight, and how that single experience had become the catalyst for a broader conversation about racial bias in America. He spoke about the importance of recognizing unconscious bias, of fostering environments where everyone felt seen and respected. Then it was Patricia's turn. She stepped up to the microphone, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "I never thought my story would become something this big," she began, her eyes scanning the crowd. "I'm just a mother who wanted to visit her son. But what happened to me, what happens to so many people like me, can't be ignored anymore." The room was silent, hanging on her every word. "I've lived my whole life dealing with the kind of bias that's hard to explain. It's subtle, but it's there. And for a long time, I didn't think speaking up would make any difference. But I've learned that sometimes the smallest voice can make the biggest impact." She paused, glancing at David, who gave her an encouraging nod. "We all deserve to be treated with dignity, and we all deserve to live in a world where our worth isn't questioned because of the color of our skin. I hope that by sharing my story, others will feel empowered to share theirs too. Because that's how we create real change, by standing together, by speaking up, and by refusing to be silent." The room erupted in applause, and Patricia felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had never imagined herself as a public figure. But now, standing on that stage, she realized that her voice had power, and she wasn't alone in this fight. As she and David left the stage, the applause still ringing in their ears, Patricia felt a sense of peace settle over her. The fight wasn't over, but they had come so far. And now, more than ever, she believed that real change was possible. The weeks after the conference felt like a new chapter in Patricia and David's lives. The national stage they had stepped onto had catapulted their story into something much bigger than either of them had imagined. Their message of resilience, dignity, and the importance of standing up to bias continued to resonate with people across the country. But with the movement now gaining traction, both Patricia and David felt ready to step back from the public eye and let others carry the torch forward. For Patricia, the sense of accomplishment was mixed with relief. She had done what she never thought she would, stood up, shared her story, and helped spark a conversation that had led to real, tangible change. But more than that, she had been able to reconnect with her son on a deeper level. The journey reminded them both of the strength of their bond and the importance of family. One sunny afternoon, Patricia sat on the porch of David's home, enjoying the warmth of the sun on her face. It had been a few days since the conference, and she felt a sense of peace that had been missing from her life for so long. The whirlwind of media attention had finally begun to die down, and she was able to return to the quiet life she had always preferred. David joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea, and sat down next to her. He had a look of calm on his face that Patricia hadn't seen in months. The tension that had once consumed him had eased, and he seemed more at peace with the direction their lives had taken. "I've been thinking," David began, handing her a cup of tea. "Maybe it's time for us to step back. We've done what we set out to do. The movement's growing, people are talking, and I think it's time to let others take the lead." Patricia nodded, sipping her tea. "I agree. It's been a long journey, and we've both done more than we ever expected. But I'm ready for some quiet time." David smiled. "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the birds fluttering in the trees. For the first time in months, there was no pressure, no media, no demands for their time. It was just them, mother and son, enjoying a peaceful afternoon together. Later that evening, as Patricia packed her suitcase in preparation for her flight back home, she reflected on everything that had happened since she had first arrived in San Francisco. What had started as a simple trip to visit her son had turned into a life-changing experience, not just for her, but for so many others who had heard her story. But now she was ready to go back to her quiet life. She missed the familiarity of her home, the comfort of her routine. And though the world had changed in many ways since she had shared her story, Patricia knew that some things would always remain the same. There would always be challenges. There would always be biases to confront. But she also knew that she had done her part to make the world a little better for those who would come after her. As Patricia zipped up her suitcase, David appeared in the doorway, watching her with a soft smile. "Are you sure you're ready to go?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Patricia smiled back at him. "I am. It's time." David nodded, though Patricia could see the sadness in his eyes. He had grown used to having her around, and though their time together had been intense, it had also been precious. "I'll miss you," David said, walking over to give her a hug. "I'll miss you too," Patricia replied, hugging him tightly. "But I'll be back. And you can always come visit me. I think it's time you took a break from all the tech stuff and enjoyed some peace and quiet." David laughed. "Maybe you're right. I could use a break." The next morning, David drove Patricia to the airport. The drive was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with the unspoken understanding that they had shared something special over the past few months. As they pulled up to the curb, David helped her with her bags, and they stood together for a moment, neither wanting to say goodbye just yet. "You take care of yourself, okay?" Patricia said, looking up at him with a smile. "I will, Mom," David replied, his voice soft. "And you do the same. I'll call you soon." Patricia nodded, hugging him one last time before heading into the airport. As she walked through the sliding doors, she turned to give him a final wave, and David waved back, watching her disappear into the crowd. Patricia's flight back home was quiet and uneventful, a stark contrast to the flight that had started it all. As she settled into her seat, she reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The memories of that initial flight, the cold treatment, the subtle judgments, it all seemed so far away now. She had grown from that experience, and so had David. They had both found their voices, and they had used them to make a difference. As the plane ascended into the sky, Patricia closed her eyes and smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. She was heading back to her life, but this time, she carried with her the knowledge that she had been part of something important, and that was enough. Back in San Francisco, David returned to his work with a renewed sense of purpose, but he no longer felt the need to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. The movement they had started would continue, led by others who shared their vision for a more just and equitable society. David knew that he would continue to be a part of it, but he also understood that change was a collective effort. He spent his days working on his tech projects, but he also made time for himself, for the things that brought him joy. He reconnected with friends, took time to explore the city, and even started planning a trip to visit his mother in a few weeks. One afternoon, as David sat in his office, he received an email from a young woman who had attended one of his talks. She wrote about how Patricia's story had inspired her to stand up against the discrimination she had been facing at her workplace. Her words were filled with gratitude, and she expressed how much it had meant to her to see someone like Patricia, someone who had lived through so many struggles, found her voice and shared her truth. David read the email, his heart swelling with pride for his mother. She had always been his hero, but now he realized just how many people she had touched, how many lives she had changed. David replied to the email, thanking the woman for her kind words, and as he sent it off, he smiled, knowing that his mother's legacy would live on through the countless people she had inspired. A few weeks later, David boarded a plane to visit Patricia. This time, there was no media frenzy, no cameras waiting at the airport, just him, excited to spend time with his mother in the peace and quiet of her hometown. When he arrived, Patricia was waiting for him at the gate. Her face lit up when she saw him. They hugged tightly, and as they walked through the airport together, David felt a sense of calm wash over him. It was a new chapter for both of them, one filled with hope, with love, and with the knowledge that they had made a difference. and that was all they needed. Thank you for following this emotional journey. We hope that through Patricia and David's story, you found inspiration in the values of patience, courage, and the power of standing up for fairness. If this story resonated with you and you want to continue supporting meaningful content that inspires change, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll be the first to hear about more stories that aim to uplift and motivate, encouraging a better and more equitable world for all. Hit the subscribe button and join us as we continue to share stories that matter. Thank you.